This is PTV World. I'm SYED. You're watching Faultlines. Europe is sitting at the crossroads of crisis. These crises are peculiar and unique in nature. Europe has not faced a crisis of this scale during the last several decades. And let me list them down. The first and foremost is the economic challenges. Economic challenges are becoming paramount with inflation rising to a record-breaking level. European Union is facing more than 8.1% inflation collectively together. But the problem for some countries is far more serious, like Turkey, that is facing 56% inflation, and Estonia facing 20% inflation. In the recent past, we see no example of crisis of such scales. Larger economies like United Kingdom and Germany are also facing catastrophic effect of rising fuel prices. The UK economy is very close to a situation of slump. There was a recovery expected, but due to soaring inflation, the situation has gone from bad to worse. The other problem that Europe is facing at the moment is influx of refugees. So far, 7 million refugees have entered in Europe from Ukraine, and this has strained the supply lines and demand from basic essential products and services to an unprecedented level. Then, as I said earlier, due to the problems between Russia and Ukraine, there is a staggering energy crisis in Europe. Energy not only becoming more expensive, but also becoming more scarce. For economies like Germany, it's a nightmare to face a situation where gas and fuel are not available and the industrial process cannot be halted. And amid all of the crises that I have just listed down, war is knocking at the door of Europe. Our team has prepared a package. Watch the package before I bring my first guest to the program.
European Union lawmakers are backing ambitious bloc-wide targets, and thus European Union has reached a deal backing stricter climate rules that will eliminate carbon emissions from new cars by 2035 and a multi-billion euro fund to shield poorer citizens from carbon dioxide costs. Unveiling a new strategic vision, the Transatlantic Security Alliance NATO leaders have invited Sweden and Finland to join the alliance after Turkey withdrew its objections to the new members, a decision that once ratified would end decades of Nordic neutrality by putting the two countries under the United States nuclear umbrella. US President Joe Biden pledged more American troops, warplanes, and warships of Europe as NATO agreed to the biggest strengthening of its deterrence since the Cold War in response to Ukraine crisis. For sake of alternatives to Russian gas imports, the European Commission has announced a 210 billion euro plan to end its dependency on Russian fossil fuels in a span of 5 years and speed up its transition to green energy. Indicating challenges to European border management, the United Nations Refugee Agency revealed that about 47,000 people arrived by sea in Italy, Greece, Spain, Cyprus, and Malta so far this year, and food shortages caused by the Ukraine conflict threaten increased arrival from Africa and Middle East. The death of nearly 24 people while trying to break through a border fence between Morocco and the Spanish enclave of Melilla has already sparked global outrage.
To join me in this program, I have a robust panel of guests. My first guest is joining me from the United Kingdom. He's Mr. James Carey. He's a Roosevelt Scholar from Magdalene College, Cambridge University. James, I welcome you to my program.
SHABAHAT, thank you for having me.
And to join me from Islamabad over the phone is Mohammad Taimur Khan. He's Research Associate, Europe and Russia at Institute of Strategic Studies, Islamabad. Taimur, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, sir.
James, starting from you, so at the moment, European Union is going through a very rough patch, as I said in the introduction. COVID seems to be one of the major challenges that EU is trying to grapple with. What are your comments on it?
Well, it's really interesting, actually. Like most of the problems that you described eloquently in the opening here, SHABAHAT, we see that the European Union is facing this in different ways across the geographic locations that it holds across the 27 member states. We can see lots of differentials in the way that countries are dealing with COVID, and fundamentally at a fundamental level, beg your pardon. What we're seeing a differential again increasing between the wealthier per capita states in the European Union and the poorer per capita states in the European Union. And like most of the issues that you have raised at the beginning of the program, the European Union member states continue to exist somewhat in geopolitical conflict on a lot of different items. So whilst we do see a lot of fundamental agreement going on at the moment in the European Union in 2022 on several issues, including Ukraine, we also see a lot of differentiation, and we also see a lot of geopolitical tension existing, including in the provisions of healthcare, including in how the European Union is able to intercede in these problems. Because, of course, one of the things that's most important here is that healthcare was not one of the things ceded to European Union control in any of the treaties. So at its fundamental level, it is a role for the 27 member states of the European Union to deal with by themselves. And whilst there is cooperation, that cooperation waxes and wanes depending upon their individual bilateral alliances. So it's a really difficult situation currently. And as you say, it has produced quite significant challenges for the European Union.
Taimur, coming to you, so do you agree with what James said, and do you actually believe that at the moment the fuel prices and energy crisis are primarily the reason why European economy is slowing down or is not taking up the pace as it was taking up back in 2021?
Well, yes, as far as his points on the COVID-19 pandemic are concerned, that yes, the economic slowdown that the European Union is experiencing, one of the major factors is because of the COVID-19 pandemic, but a lot of it has to do with the recent Russia-Ukraine war that started in late February this year. Because the entire political and security landscape of the Euro-Atlantic region was shifted, because initially, especially when President Joe Biden took over, the main point of concern for the Western elites or for the Western democracies was combating the climate change. But all of a sudden, after February 24th, the entire conversation came back to the traditional threats to security and economy, which was a war, an active war, which the European continent had not seen ever since the end of the World War. So definitely the entire attention has now been shifted to all the traditional threats, mainly emanating from Russia towards Europe. So yes, and because of that war, there has been several other issues that have also been exasperated, because as Russia has launched this, aggression against Ukraine, it has disrupted global supply chains, which has fueled further commodity price pressures and heightened uncertainty. And the EU is the first in line among advanced economies to take a hit because of that. And due to its geographical proximity to the Russia and Ukraine, heavy reliance on imported fossil fuels, especially from Russia, and high integration in the global value chain, large inflows of people fleeing from the war, as many as 5 million in the first 10 weeks since the start of the war, pose a further organizational and coordination challenge for the European Union.
Coming back to you, Mr. Kerry, so since we last spoke in this program, there are two major developments on the geopolitical front of Europe. One is the inclusion of Sweden and Finland. They have applied for membership of NATO, something that is not welcomed by Russia. And the other is quite concerning, rather I would say alarming development of Kaliningrad being stopped or being encircled by the neighboring country Estonia, which is actually seizing the trade and access for Russia. So don't you believe these are two more major reasons why Europe is more under a threat of an all-out war today more than it was a couple of weeks before?
That's a really good question. I think the framing certainly. We the last time we spoke, the ascension of member status for Nordic countries was off topic then, and it has come to pass that they've been able to work through some of the issues that were brought up by NATO, by Turkey, an existing NATO member. Whether that increases the pressure on Europe or not is an interesting question, but it certainly does reflect the pressure that has already been there. It certainly does reflect the fundamental pressures that now exist on European states to seemingly choose a side here. You spoke in the lead into to the question there about Nordic the ability for Nordic states to be able to bridge gaps here. And what seems to be going on now with the two states' ascension to NATO membership seems to be a choosing of sides. That seems to fundamentally be what's going on. And then moving to Kaliningrad, whilst the EU seems to be close to working through that and providing a deal for Russia to be able to send resources to Kaliningrad, given that it is a domestic transfer, and that seems to be the excuse that that the European Union is using to being able to assuage that potentially dangerous situation. It nonetheless shows exactly what you're saying, which is that when land wars occur, there are unpredictable situations that avail themselves. And fundamentally, what occurs in a land war is that there is a dangerous situation in which neighboring states, in which difficulties like exclaves can produce rather dangerous scenarios in which states can inadvertently or fundamentally against their geopolitical interests and decisions made previous, be pulled into fighting in that war. And this is something that we need to look out for. In the next, we will see the European Union come to an agreement, I believe, with Russia within the next 72 to 96 hours, and that will assuage that Kaliningrad situation. But nevertheless, with a Nordic boundary now that is specifically NATO-based, specifically part of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization with Russia, that adds to Russia's boundaries with NATO and fundamentally seems to increase the bilateral decisions that are being made here, where one is being forced to choose.
Taimur, how would you comment on the same?
Well, definitely, as you rightly mentioned in the beginning, that there is a high chance of another conflict breaking out in northeastern part of Europe. Because I say that because now, after the imposition of sanctions on majority of the Russian products that were being transited from the Russian mainland to Kaliningrad, the leverage that the Russians had, any other leverage besides war that the Russians had against Lithuania is no longer there. So the only options that Russia has now is to wage a ground war against Lithuania. So that definitely increases chances of any ground conflict taking place in that area. And on top of that, Russia also clearly and categorically stated that it will retaliate. But as Mr. James rightly mentioned, that the leadership is very much cognizant of the threats that are emanating from that place. So they are actually the European Commission is currently discussing to roll out some exemptions on banned Russian goods. And I think that will definitely help in easing the tensions over there with regards to, the conflict that might start between Lithuania and Russia. Plus, I also believe that because of the unpredictability that President Putin has displayed over the past several years, and especially during the war against Ukraine, I think that his impulsiveness, it cannot, you have to, take it as a credible threat. That one cannot take his word just for the sake of if he's saying that he's not going to launch a war or, any attack against Lithuania, because he has displayed that he is an unpredictable person and, nothing is off limits as long as, he is capable of doing it. Plus, I also believe that this issue of Kaliningrad is also personal for President Putin, because I read this morning that his wife, Miss Putina, she is also from Kaliningrad. So I believe that since he has a very strong, nostalgic personality, his idiosyncrasy is very much nostalgic. So I also believe that it will also add to his calculations with regards to Lithuania.
Coming back to you, Mr. Carey, so with all of this together, don't you think that there is going to be further stress on resources? There is going to be a further, exacerbating energy crisis will go worsen from here. And this is going to affect some of the Eastern Europe's economies more than the rest of the European countries, which might just affect the overall support that EUs and NATO members enjoy with each other while planning for Russia together?
Undoubtedly, I don't see any way in which this gets better before it gets worse in certainly different ways. We're only beginning to feel the effects currently now in Eastern Europe of the breakdown of supply chains, really. We're only starting to see that in Western Europe too. We're only starting to experience the fundamental stresses that are put onto supply chains when you have a land war on the European continent. And fundamentally, this will put pressure, increased pressure upon those that are more dependent upon those supply chains, those economies that are more fundamentally structured around those supply chains. And what you will fundamentally see is that the more embedded Western European economies will be better able to bulwark against these fundamental challenges. But again, going back to what we were talking about earlier, this produces an almost two-track European Union response here, where there are economies in Western Europe that are able to fundamentally ride out these challenges as they are currently presented. Now, that may change, obviously, but as they're currently presented, they seem able currently to be able to ride those out, whilst at the same time, their allies amongst the 27 member states further east are fundamentally having to deal with challenges like refugees. As you noted, Poland has been incredibly generous in taking on Ukrainian refugees. And this is going to be felt fundamentally in the way that Eastern European politics reacts to these changes, and also expressed in the way that the economies are able to fundamentally bounce back. And that all spells a really dangerous situation for both the European Union and also the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is beginning to put more military hardware on that eastern border to protect its member states. This all suggests that there are increasing geopolitical challenges to come, and also new ones that we can't really predict at the moment.
Taimur, not only what Mr. Kerry said, but also clubbed with it are some other economic factors, which apparently shows us that all the plans that the European Union or NATO had against Russia, particularly the plans with regards to the sanctions, have not worked as well as thought of earlier. And there are increasing sanctions. There are new kind of sanctions being introduced. A recent one was ban on import of gold from Russia. So what do you think is the reason of it? Is the West not happy with the way sanctions are working against Russia? Or is it not going to hurt back the economy of heartland of Europe, with the import of metals now becoming another reason of concern?
Well, sir, initially when the European Union or the Western powers embarked on the strategy of imposing sanctions against Russia, initially, in my humble opinion, those sanctions were not really that serious, and they believed that minor sanctions would definitely deter Russian aggression against Ukraine. But they should have definitely kept this in mind, that Russia had made its economy accustomed to bear those sanctions at least for more than 1.5 decades. So the Russian economy was ready to absorb all those blows, and it had already planned that after it launches that aggression against Ukraine, the West will definitely respond with economic sanctions, and the Russian economy was ready for that. Plus, the Western economic sanctions blows was also, what you can say was partially ineffective because of the Indian and the Chinese factor, or the different other allies of Russia. They actually help provide Russian economy with a cushion to fill the vacuum that was left by the Western energy market that had left in the Russian economy. So the Chinese were there, the Indians were there, and even the Chinese and Indians continue to fill that gap that was left by the Western economies. India continues to buy cheap Russian oil on huge bulks. As you are aware that more than 35 million barrels of oil have been imported by Russia. The Russian Ural oil have been imported by Russia only in the last 2 to 3 months. this is according to the latest data that was reported by Al Jazeera yesterday, that more than $35 million barrels of crude oil was imported by India, refined inside of the Indian refineries, and then being sold back to the European countries.
Tamur, I need to take Kerry's point of view here. Mr. Kerry, you heard what he said. Economies like Pakistan, economies like other subcontinental countries have crushed under these massive inflation of prices. But when it comes to India, there is an exemption for India somehow. Are we sons of a lesser god? We are being viewed differently than India. If Pakistan was buying or another country was buying this volume of oil from Russia, how would have been the response of the West?
I think it's a really good question, and obviously, given the domestic audience here, it's a very important one to ask. I think one thing that India fundamentally has going for it with the West, as it were, is its size, is its fundamental ability to affect decision making in the West. And therefore, what seems to be fundamentally occurring is that there seems to be a way that India is being able to play both sides here, and is being able to do so quite effectively, to be honest, and using alliances like the Quad Alliance to be able to then fundamentally move around that, and still, as was being said there, being able to buy crude oil and being able to refine it in an Indian context. Now, this to the point that you raised as well about subcontinent economies here, is that subcontinent economies are feeling this fundamentally, and there needs to be a solution provided here. There needs to be a way that a solution can be found by the West, because otherwise, what you'll then consequently find is you'll start to find a weakening support for the West in this battle against Russia through the support of Ukraine. And this is not going to be accomplished if economies are consequently fundamentally undermined in the process.
Thank you very much, Mr. James Kerry. Thank you very much, Mr. Mohammad Tamur Khan, for being guest in our program today.
Very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, we'll take a break and we'll join you back with the second segment of the program. Stay with us. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Every problem that has a political or geopolitical angle has a larger economic angle associated with it. There is an economic dimension of every conflict on the face of earth. To explore the problem further on a part of the economic angles associated with it, we have invited an economic expert who sits in Europe and is going to tell us more about the economic challenges that Europe is facing at the moment. I am honored to be joined by Dr. Bilal Baghis. He's an economist and expert of economics based in Istanbul. Dr. Bilal, I welcome you to the program.
Thank you, SYED, SHABAHAT. Thank you for having me.
Dr. Bilal, anti-European Union or anti-Europe sentiment is on the rise and has an economic angle to it. Many believe there is a disparity between various European nations. Would you agree with this statement?
Well, inequalities in the EU, they are definitely on the rise, and these rising economic inequalities, they are believed to have increased this anti-EU sentiment and decrease, of course, the public trust in the EU and its institutions, both directly and indirectly. And this includes the EU institutions such as the European Central Bank, their monetary policy decisions, including the most recent QE policies of the past decade. And inflation rates in the euro area, they also reached a new high of 8.6% in June. And this also affects the poor disproportionately, of course. And along with that, the political stance against Russia and increasing food and energy prices, they are all adding to this mistrust, I would say.
Dr. Bilal, I was reading one of the reports published in one of the international papers, and it says that with energy prices rising further, the inflation rate is going to hit 11% in autumn in England. Now, a mainstream economy, England, that is one of the economic powerhouses of Europe. We see England, France, Germany being the icons of Europe. How it is going to affect the rest of the Europe, and what does it tell us about the gravity of situation in Europe?
So the inflation rates in the UK, they are already at the 40-year high of 9.1%. And the Bank of England is expecting a further rise up to 11% in October, along with the energy prices. So that is indeed one of the reasons the European leaders and G7 leaders, they were talking about price caps on oil, especially. And in general, like broadly speaking, inflation rates in the US, UK, Canada, even Australia, New Zealand, they're all at their 40-year highs. And in many European economies, inflation rates are at their 30-year highs. And this is also indeed the primary reason the world economy is facing a tightening cycle, in especially the Western world, and rising in interest rates. And these, of course, could, in the medium term, lead to another potential recession.
Dr. Bilal, European economies are trying to strangulate the Russian economy as much as possible with the help of various kinds of sanctions. And we see a different kind of sanctions coming after every week or 2 weeks. But Russia has announced recently that when the winter comes, they are going to cut down the gas supply to 60%. How fearful is this announcement for Europe?
So the newly built Nord Stream 2 project is already paused. It's not active. And supply from Nord Stream 1 pipeline, as you just pointed out, it is decreasing. So Russia is a critical supplier of energy, including oil and gas, to the European economies. And Russia has 19% of all gas reserves around the world. Its biggest natural gas exporter, second biggest oil exporter. And in 2021, Russia was providing 25% of all European Union's oil demand. It was supplying 40% of the natural gas demand and 42% of the coal demand from the Europe. So it is a critical provider of all these energy sources. And all these factors, I would say, they will surely boost the energy prices, in particular affect the European economies. And it will also probably force Europe to decrease its consumption by up to 30%, according to the International Energy Agency. It could also potentially lead to new recessions even before the impact of this current tightening cycle is observed.
Dr. Bilal, this is not only going to make the life of households more difficult, but also it's going to have serious impact on the mainstream industry, particularly for economies like Germany that make a living on their industrial manufacturing. This is a major source of their income. So this must be a very worrisome scenario for the industrial part of Germany.
uh, in particular the German economy, but overall the whole European economy, it will definitely be negatively impacted. So in 2020, there was just to remember, 6% contraction in the European economies overall. And in 2021, there was a huge increase in growth in European economies. They had a growth rate of 5.4%. And this is according to the World Bank estimates. And it was the highest growth rate since the early 1970s in Europe in general. And uh, by the beginning of 2022, the growth rates are still positive, although not as high as it is aimed for. Um, there is a 0.3% growth rate in the euro area, 0.4% in the EU in general. But the surging energy and food prices, they have increased the inflation rate, as we just talked about. They are increasing the cost of production in general, and of course, negatively affecting the industrial production in all European economies, but especially the Europe's uh, main economies, such as Germany. They will be negatively affected, surely. And the energy crisis of late 2021, war in Ukraine, and new refugee waves from the northern Black Sea region, they are all negatively affecting the European economies nowadays.
Dr. Bilal, let's take the conversation forward. Help me to understand why Europe is not putting a complete ban on Russia's oil. We see Europe bringing up new kind of blockages or blockades or sanctions, things that are unprecedented, like a ban on import of gold. But they're not blocking the Russian oil altogether. What do you believe can be the reason for it?
Well, just as I mentioned earlier, the 25% of all the import, oil import of Europe is coming from Russia, and 40% of all natural gas, and 42% of all coal imports of Europe, they're coming from Russia. These are really huge amounts, and you definitely need time to diversify in that sense, to find new sources of natural gas, oil, even coal that is used for electrical production. So these huge dependence in general over the commodities on the Europe side, it makes it very, very difficult to completely ban all the imports.
But what does this price cap then mean? Because Europe has put a price cap on the buying of Russian oil. Because if Russia is not getting the right price, it can sell its oil elsewhere. Why would it sell to Europe altogether?
Well, Russia is definitely also looking for ways to diversify its markets, energy markets, and on the other side, uh, U.S. for at least a few decades they were pushing Europe to diversify its sources of commodities in general, I would say. But for the moment, there is this bilateral dependence, and they have to work on ways to deal with the current crisis, I would say.
Going forward, we would also like to take your comments on the migration or the refugees coming. There are 7 million of Ukrainians that have entered in different areas of Europe. Now, to us, this is the largest influx of refugees in Europe since the Second World War. How do you see it? Because many in Europe are propagating the positive aspect of it, but doesn't it affect the already strained supply chain of essentials of life in Europe?
Well, it is causing a lot of issues, including the public discontent in Europe. So Europe has long been dealing with migration waves from North Africa, Middle East, even Near East, and recently from the northern Black Sea, from Ukraine, as you just pointed out, about over 7 million people they have migrated. Uh, So Europe, it does indeed need younger population and labor force. So human capital is certainly one critical contribution. These migrants, they could be used in. However, there is also a need for new regulations, policies to help deal with the anti-immigrant sentiment or public discontent growing in Europe. So governments, international organizations, humanitarian organizations, they need to work together to develop more comprehensive policies, actions to sustainably manage migration waves and facilitate its potential positive outcomes, I would say.
And do you believe that all these refugees will be going back, once the war is over? Because the major infrastructure of Ukraine is almost lost. There is a very serious war being fought in the heart of Ukraine. So do you believe these refugees are here to stay for a longer period of time?
Well, this is also a huge debate, even in Turkey, just as it is in Europe. Well, definitely not all of them, but there will certainly be a huge amount of these migrants going back to their home countries once peace is settled and once these economies are back on their foot. But for the moment, it seems like it will take a relatively long period, at least a decade, I would say.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bilal Begis, for being guest in our program today.
Thanks for the invite. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, this was Dr. Bilal Begis from Turkey, and he was telling us about the economic challenges that Europe is facing today. One of the important factors that he mentioned, that there is a huge gap between the economies of Eastern Europe and Western Europe. The challenges for the East are far more severe and drastic than in the rest of Europe, particularly the West. But even the West, or the extreme West of Europe, that is Great Britain, is taking the brunt of the energy crisis today. As you rightly pointed out, more than 9% inflation is being observed in England today. That is going to rise to another 11%. And England's economy is going into a major slump. Germany is already afraid of the upcoming gas crisis that is going to take a brunt to its industrial process. And the rest of the Europe is also quite into a catch-22 situation. Let's see how Europe cope up with all these challenges, because if diplomacy fails, there are no other good choices for us to go forward with the situation. We'll join you tomorrow again with another program. And until then, Allah Hafiz.